Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on supporting grassroots movements for climate justice in the midst of a pandemic, the Climate Justice Organizing Hub. My name is Ina Shalala. I'm the Director of Learning and Partnerships at Philanthropic Foundations Canada, PFC. To begin, we would like to acknowledge the many territories of Turtle Island, Canada, on which we work and reside. These territories are home to many Indigenous peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years and continue to live here. As settlers, immigrants, and descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of this land and territory and hope for a more just future together. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the discussions at any time, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer your questions as much as possible during the Q&A period at the end of the webinar. If you have any comments, resources to share with all participants, please do not hesitate to use the chat box. Simultaneous translation is offered in French and in English. La traduction simultanée est disponible en français. Il vous suffit de cliquer sur l'icône interprétation et sélectionner la langue française pour écouter la conversation en langue française. So the topic for today's webinar is grassroots movement organizers, non-qualified donees, and the growing connection between climate and social justice movements. We have decided at PFC to mark Earth Day on April 22nd to focus our Wednesday webinar on these important issues. By the way, this year's theme for the Earth Day is Restore Our Earth. So without further ado, I will turn the time over to our amazing panelists for this session and to our moderator today, Annie Berube. Annie is Program Director at the McConnell Foundation. So over to you, Annie, and thank you for being with us.
Merci, Ines. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be joining you today. I'm joining you from unceded Algonquin-Anishinaabe territory here in Ottawa. And it's my pleasure to be moderating this really interesting discussion that we're going to have today in the hopes of learning and understanding the critical and important and complex and wonderful world of movement building and organizing for climate justice and the challenges and opportunities that it poses for philanthropic foundations in supporting this work. We have a little discussion plan and there will be time for questions at the end. So please indicate in the chat or in the Q&A if you'd like to pose a question at any point during the presentation and we'll address your question. So I will introduce our three panelists. I'm joined by Ashley Torres. Ashley is the Student and Regional Networks Coordinator at the Climate Justice Organizing Hub. And Ashley is a climate justice student leader in Quebec. She's the co-spokesperson for La Collective La Sève in 2019 and 2020. And she's a well-known spokesperson for the student movement in Quebec. We're also joined by Tom Liakas. Tom is the Executive Director of the Climate Justice Organizing Hub. And Tom has a long-standing experience in movement building and serving in NGOs in the US, in the UK, in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And we are also joined by Aurore Forêt. Aurore is the Climate Program Director at the Trottier Family Foundation. The Trottier Family Foundation who's been supporting the Climate Justice Organizing Hub in Quebec. So welcome to all the panelists. So we'll start with a bit of an informal question to kick off our discussion. We did mention in the title of this presentation that we're talking about movement building and organizing in a time of pandemic, which for many of us keeps us up at night for many, many reasons, but maybe specific to your work. I'll open up with Tom. Just let us know what keeps you up at night these days.
Thanks, Annie, and hi, everyone. Happy to be here joining you all from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And yeah, what keeps me up at night these days is wondering how many people end up showing up to our virtual conference, which happens in 3 weeks. And since everything is outreach is digital and feedback is digital, it's so hard to get a sense of if an event is really taking off or not. All you see are signups, and you know everyone doesn't show up in the end. So yeah, that has me biting my nails and staying up some nights.
Yeah, this new strange virtual world that we're all trapped into is challenging for many reasons, but specifically for movement building and organizing, I can imagine, which relies so much on the personal touch and the one-to-one connection. How about you, Ashley? Anything keeping you up at night these days? Are you sleeping well?
Well, I'm in my finals, so there's no such thing as sleeping when you're doing your finals at school. And but yeah, I think like Tom is just in terms of like this challenges of organizing online. We don't have access to our campuses, and so eager to come back, but at the same time, that uncertainty of when we will be able to do that and when we will be able to like sort of pick up where we were it last is what like how will the scene change? That's I think concerns that we have right now as students.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm also not sleeping very great at night. But yeah, I'd say these days it's mostly reflecting on the situation with COVID more generally. The third wave, like if a year ago someone told me there would be a third wave, I'm not sure I would have believed it. And just keep drawing parallels, you know, between fighting COVID and what we need to do around climate justice, but also racial and social justice, just the way that it has changed over the last year, our conditions so drastically. And I think to what we're going to talk about today, like what that means for the well-being of change makers, of people who are mobilizing despite it all. In the work that I get to do, I work with a lot of people, so I am wondering about how they're doing these days.
And this is what we're going to talk about today. The faces, the individuals, the people behind these great movements and organizing that we often take for granted, right? I think we can be really blessed in Canada and take certain social policies and social programs for granted, and forgetting that, you know, before we had universal healthcare or gay rights or many other rights that we take for granted, there were years and years of movement building and organizing behind that. And so perhaps I'll start with Tom to really explain to us funders who are not in the midst of this every day, what is your area of work and what it is that you do at the Climate Justice Organizing Hub.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. And also thanks for pointing to the unseen work behind movement building, because, you know, that really is where we're situated. I mean, I think that my observation working with foundations in the US prior to this was that movement moments, big movement moments like the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests were, you know, attention grabbing and galvanizing, and, you know, mobilized a lot of funder reflection and activity. But those are just kind of the tips of the iceberg. And I think Ashley will be able to speak to this from recent firsthand experience, just what goes into building up to such a big movement moment, how many months and years it takes to get there, and then what do you have to do after that to maintain the energy, the networks, and just the well-being of organizers, the people who made it happen. So, you know, I know that, you know, again, in the US, these big moments led to big shifts in philanthropy. I've had exchanges with the Ford Foundation and how they built the BUILD program after social justice protests in the States. Obviously, there's a lot more work to be done there to improve social conditions, but, you know, that plus the Trump administration just really catalyzed a shift towards supporting movement building and new structures that have risen up to do that. And we're very grateful to the Soutenir Foundation for doing the same here in Canada on our side around climate justice. But, you know, to be honest, a lot more of that needs to happen if we want to keep seeing big transformative moments in the future.
How about you, Ahar? Any context you want to provide in terms of why the Trottier Family Foundation got involved when it did. What was the moment that triggered your involvement?
Yeah, I mean, to build on the last thing that Tom said, actually, in terms of context, one thing that I think we try to remember and that is useful to ground ourselves in today is the level of resources that are needed to match the scale of the crisis, the climate crisis, but also all the way that it intersects with the other ones. And there's studies that have been done on philanthropic dollars, and I don't want to put climate just in a silo. This is not what we're doing today, but it's important to know that on a global scale, there's less than 2% of global philanthropic funding that goes to climate mitigation. So I'm not talking here about adaptation or conservation. And within that, if you look at how much foundations spend on public engagement, quote unquote, which can include movement building, but is not limited to that, it takes you to like 0.02% of global philanthropy. It's a very tiny slice. And I think it's and the proportions in Canada are somewhat similar in terms of the climate mitigation work that is funded. And it's good to remember that because we need more resources than what we are currently putting in this area of work in this field. And I think that's why the Trottier Family Foundation is also very involved in this work and in collaborating with others and being proactive, so that we can have a greater impact in the overall sector. The Family Foundation is based in Montreal, and we do a range of funding on environmental and climate issues, health, community, and education. And climate is really a growing part of that granting. That's, there's over 100 grants a year overall, but the approach that we take with climate is, again, climate mitigation, but also how it intersects with other issues, housing, health, racial justice, social justice, and really being active in collaborations. So we help create the LC3 network, the Greater Montreal Climate Fund, create the hub. And back when there were the mobilizations in 2019, the foundation was looking at what it was funding in climate. And so we funded a lot of climate communications, a lot of policy, a lot of research, some organizing and some mobilization work. There's really great organizations doing that work. But there was also a gap in being able to sustain those moments in between, just what Tom said, that it's not just the moment where it's very visible that the mobilization has succeeded, it's everything in between from before and after. And there were pre-existing links and connections between our board members, Sylvie Trottier and Claire Trottier, who knew Tom, and that kind of helped having the initial conversations and the initial genesis of why supporting climate movements and climate justice movements were important and why it was a need and a gap. And so from our perspective, it was another kind of approach and another theory of change we could support because we need all hands on deck and because we can support policy and research and continue to do that and support movement building. And when we look at history, we need those to succeed. So we can talk more about the hub and how it came about for the initial stages, but that's kind of where we operate in terms of the climate work.
I just want to point out something really important that you mentioned. It's like we need all the theories of change, right? And we need all the strategies all at once. And there are many theories of change advancing climate action and climate justice. And clearly, movement building and organizing is a critical one and complementary to everything else that we all support. And speaking of organizing, so there's a lot to build to get there, and there's a lot that happens behind closed door that we don't see. Maybe Ashley, you can give us a little bit of the history of what it took to mobilize and organize all these marches that we've seen and the other amazing mobilization that's led by the student movement.
Yeah, I think there's like this misconception, right, of those big moments like the 27th of September, that they just happen it was like a call to action, and people just showed up, and we were 500,000 people in the streets of Montreal. Usually I blame a bit the media because that's what they show, that's what they talk about, you know, like us making signs, and that's organizing. But there's a lot of more work to that, right? So to give people an idea of how like the student movement was able to mobilize and help mobilize those 500,000 people in the street the 27th of September, it started in a cafe with 20 students of the University of Montreal, and where people gather and were like, you know, Legault doesn't even have a plan. And we were students who had eco anxiety and wanted to do something and really change the narrative that was not present, that we felt that was not present in that emergent sense. And so we started organizing, and from February until the first March was, it was the 15th of March when we had 150,000 students on strike in our campuses. And how that came to be, it wasn't just like, again, like a call. We didn't just call a press conference and we make a call to action. We actually travel around the province, knock on doors of students, and sort of really try to engage with them and try to see, hey, we have a role to play in this movement. There's a crisis, and how do you guys want to participate, and how do we build and be part of this change that we felt that was necessary? So then quickly we started to engage with other parts of the climate movement after that 15th of March, that it was very successful. And we sort of started noticing that there was other people in that community that were already organizing for the 27th of September. And then we started building from that. But there was a lot of hard work, a lot of, you know, you have students who stopped school. I was a full-time student. I became part-time because it's like 30 hours of a week of work, usually volunteered for the part of the students, because we don't have that luxury to have like paid positions. But it was intense moments of working towards that sort of momentum that we built for the 27. And a lot of times there's this misconception again that those happen overnight, but no, there's so much work to do and so much resource needed for those moments. We were lucky, we had a few key people that came to us and were able to sort of assist us and guide us, some of the student leaders, but not everybody gets that luxury. And again, we are the lucky ones, right? Because when the youth was mobilizing, there was this global phenomenon with Greta, so people were eager to have the same movement in Quebec. But I know like other social movements don't have that luxury sometimes, especially when it comes to like social movements that are less quote unquote popular, that the population has less interest in them, like racial equality. So yeah, it was a lot of hard work and still so much work left. But yeah, it was very hard to navigate that and to do that in a volunteer basis, for sure.
Yeah, and just a reminder to our audience, you know, this was September 2019 when the young Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg came to Montreal, and we had about 500,000 people in the streets of Montreal and hundreds of thousands in the streets of other cities, small town, Northwest Territories, Sault Ste. Marie, Kenora, you name it, on the streets, expressing their concern and the desire for climate justice in Canada. So this is, while we're talking about the Climate Organizing Hub in Quebec, this is a movement that's across Canada as well. And then March 2020 hit and the pandemic hit, right? And we all sent home, all sent online. And one thing that I remember when I was at the march in Montreal, and Greta said, doesn't it feel good to be here, right? There's something about the physical presence of knowing that you belong to a movement the emotional response that you get that is unparalleled. And what I love seeing you all online, I don't get that fuzzy feeling when I'm online, right? So where is the movement now? How can you take stock of how the organizers are doing, how you're staying motivated and keep on doing the work? Ashley and Tom?
Yeah, it was sort of like that high that we had on the 27th of September, and then we quickly started, okay, what's next? How do we continue that momentum? How do we, like students were eager, we were excited. There was like, oh, like we had all these people, now let's organize, let's put pressure. And then the pandemic hits, and we were in the process of building another moment. We were in the process of like endless nights of working towards another sort of moment that looked different, but for us, we will have that same feeling, and everything crashes, right? So the beginning was very hard. I think it took like an emotional toll on organizers, especially students, because now we don't even have access to our campuses. So for us who were like organizing strikes, where like weeks after that March, we were supposed to vote on like, when we talk about strikes in Quebec, we were formally democratically voting strikes and shutting down our classes. This is why we're so successful in having people on the streets. And I didn't mention this before, but that's what we were doing to get students in the streets. We were shutting down their classes in universities and in colleges and even in high schools. And now what happened when we don't have access to our campuses, when everything's online, where everything shuts down? It was very, for students, it was an emotional toll. And then also that concern of COVID sort of like increased that anxiety, right? And then there was a lot of challenges of like how we usually organize just our meetings. We will usually meet in person. Now everything had to be done online, but how like it was this sense of failure because we felt that online it wasn't combative enough, right? We felt that thing of like what Greta mentioned, that when when we're like present, it's something stronger. You have that feeling, but online people don't get that. So how do we continue? We are like not motivated. How do we make people like participate and be motivated and try to still keep up the change? It was really hard. And then summer hits, and you have this BLM movement that sort of erupts in a different matter. So we're also paying attention to, hey, these are also concerns that we need to address in our own movement. What is racial equality looks like in Quebec? What are the gaps even in our own group, in our movement? So those were like all questions that we were trying to adapt after with COVID. And we started figuring out that, work that we were not able to do because we were always running, like creating connections with these marginalized groups who are organizing. Well, now we were able to sort of step back and started working with them, like people who were organizing for a status for all. We started working with them and started building those connections that are really hard to build because we felt that we had that time. And also on the midst of all of this, there was also a wave of sexual harassment denunciations, allegations that were erupting in Quebec. And we were also paying attention to that and seeing, hey, we don't actually have a policy for sexual harassment. How do we address that? And so that was like all work that we've been kind of doing and structuring and seeing like how can we adapt to this pandemic. But that sense of failure, I think it's something that a lot of organizers felt on the ground and continue to feel like it's very hard to keep up because again, that loss of connection with people, that relationship that's fundamental to organizing, we don't have it. And so it becomes very challenging for sure.
Yeah, and I think Ashley has provided such a vivid firsthand perspective of what the movement has gone through and spoken a lot to the effects of COVID. And I'll present a bit of an outside perspective because I still consider myself an activist, but my active days are a bit more behind me. But it might surprise funders to know that there's a whole body of literature and research into the mechanics of movement building. And a lot of this comes from the US, and it's based on the history of the civil rights movement, the labor movements. And, so some of the stuff that's going on with the climate justice movement is COVID, social distance affected for sure. But there's another part that's very typical to big movements that are building, and speaks to the kind of peaks and valleys of a movement as it grows. And I took one image that really captures it and shared it in resources. Bill Moyer, who was a longtime movement strategist in the US, came up with this diagram of how movements evolve over time. And usually there's a big first peak, which is this kind of high point. And then afterwards, almost always a movement feels like it failed, because they had this really big moment, and there were 500,000 people in Montreal, at least 700,000 across the country. And you think the world is going to change and we're going to start passing climate legislation and addressing these systemic problems. But no, life goes on. The system is pretty entrenched. And that can lead to, especially for young activists who are living this for the first time, it can really feel like failure, and can be demoralizing, So that's one thing that's going on. And at the same time, social distancing kind of forces this fallow period on the whole movement. You can't go out on the streets the same way anymore. You can't gather, hundreds of people in a hall anymore. And so what else can you do? And it may seem like, this is a downtime and it might seem discouraging, but this can also be a very fertile time, because even if there wasn't social distancing, movements in these downtimes tend to look at their internal culture, look at internal conflicts that were holding them back. Ashley brought up harassment as one. The marginalized voices that felt excluded out of the mostly white climate movement, they spoke up as well, and it drove a reflection on intersectionality and greater allyship with Indigenous and social justice movements. And I would say, looking somewhat academically at this, that this is a very productive time, actually, and that it is, once again, this kind of invisible period that never shows up in the media, doesn't show up on many funders' radars, but it's actually probably building the next big moment, and needs to be supported, So that's the kind of environment that we walked into as we started the hub in May of 2020.
And it's a good segue into perhaps digging a bit deeper in what it is that the Climate Organizing Hub does. So what is that backhand support and that service that you provide to the movement, as it is, perhaps in a valley due to COVID, perhaps taking this time to better organize itself, to reflect. And so could you give us some concrete example on how you've rolled out your services and your support as this movement is always changing and evolving?
Yeah, so the kind of the funny answer to that is that when we rolled out, we intentionally rolled out with no programming and had a blank slate. And that's because I've learned over the years that when you listen to organizers and really open yourself to what their true challenges are and what's really holding them back, sometimes your assumptions are wrong. Like, oh, I have strategy ideas for you, or I have this and that. But actually, that's not what was needed, So this time around, and especially because things were so upside down and uncertain in COVID times, we intentionally rolled out with a deep listening kind of phase, with just tons of needs assessment calls with organizers. And over this first year, we've done over 80 now that I've counted, 80 different calls with different organizers. I think 40 groups were represented there. And our question was always like, how are you doing, and what is holding you back? What challenges are getting in the way of your organizing work? And over time, we started to get a picture of what are the most classic challenges, and they range from strategic frameworks to self-care and harassment policies, structures that the groups would need guidance for setting up and running internally. Really the whole gamut of everything involving building a group, a movement, and a group culture. And to us, that's all stuff that needs to be supported, because if it's holding groups back, then they're not building power. So that's where we focused. We focused first on listening, then on trying to do ad hoc service delivery. So quick workshops, not too polished, but just trying to get in there and deliver some value. And then that evolved into mass trainings. Once we knew better what lots of people needed, we started to develop training series, workshop series that could take on cohorts of 20, 25 people. And so we've got 80 people trained now. But over the year, we just did dozens and dozens of these ad hoc workshops as well and sometimes patching a specialist, somebody who's built harassment policies for other organizations, to work with organizers and create a kind of bespoke version for them. So I'll maybe pass that over to Ashley and also hear from her, like what she felt was needed as an organizer too.
Yeah, for us, it was very much something like the hub really sort of gave us the imagination. We didn't really thought of like a resource like that was so needed. Things like having access to someone who could give us an idea of like our theories of change, because we were basically just going on and doing all of this work without any sort of support. So it was really like something that was important. But also I think for the part is like we have all these networks that are based on relationships with people and how valuable that is, and how like organic, because in student movement especially, and I'm pretty sure this is common like around the globe, we have people coming in, coming out, and that challenge of like institutional knowledge is very present. How do we keep that knowledge? So for me, who is soon graduating, how do I pass on that knowledge to like the new generation of students? And we've been trying to focus on that a little bit more. And I think with Tom, like we've sort of like try to like, that's a work that we wanted to do, because yeah, that's like a very like big challenge, especially when it comes to like grassroots organizers and when it's based on volunteers. It's like, how do you make sure that this knowledge is kept, and like the new people coming in are able to have access to these kind of resources, and so having key people going about and having access to like the workshops that Tom just talked about, and then they can bring that knowledge to whatever group. For us, it was something that was like extremely valuable, and yeah, because those relationships, like that was one of the things that I was advised when I started like organizing, was like that importance of relationships and how important it is to have like key people, and those key people are the ones you will trust and value and work with. And then in Quebec, we have that sort of like community sense in environmental movements, but how do you expand that to make sure that we're not just in our bubble and like we're reaching out to different groups, was something that we've tried to like, I feel like the hub is helping us navigate through that for sure.
And I wanted to touch on one statement that Tom made at the beginning of his presentation, which I know for some philanthropic foundations, the alarm bells are ringing when Tom said, well, we start from a blank slate, we had no programming, right? And so what does that mean for philanthropic funders? It means a high level of trust, right? It means really being innovative in our philanthropy and being an ally to movements. I really wanted to congratulate the Trottier Foundation for taking that leap of faith knowing that the organizers and the hub would find their way to provide the services that were needed, but that needed time and listening and adaptation, constant responsiveness, right? So another thing that funders like to talk about is, how do we measure our success? How do we know that the projects and organization that we fund have an impact? That's always a box on a grant application, and that's a bit challenging for movement building and organizing. So perhaps Tom and Ashley, you can talk to us a little bit about how would you define the impact that you are having?
Yeah, that's always the hard question, right? How do you know we are actually affecting change that we want to see? I think for us, in the short amount of time that we were organizing, because I mean, there's people who've been doing this for so many years. Things like we were able to create this discussion, right, around the province, and I think that's something that, like, a concrete impact that we felt that we had, right? We had previously, for us, mobilizing, Legault didn't even have like a plan for the environment, and now we have a plan that we can criticize. um, and so, like, we made this narrative and we created this narrative around environment in the media that I feel like we were part of that. uh, and then that's like the concrete impact that we can observe or see. But there's also the impacts that are like more unseen, that maybe become more personal sometimes, or is more like the group has that sense but the outsiders will not, and is the sense of like us creating a movement and having so many hubs around the province. We were pre like active hubs. We had like 35 campuses where we were active, and so we were continuing to grow that and building relationships. uh, and I think something that how we can measure impact is, how do we make sure that those hubs or whatever groups that we were trying to like uh, help and put forward, that mentorship that I was talking previously for us is something that's very important. That sort of like passing of knowledge, that makes sure that we have this uh, this sort of community building, and that community feels very strong. But there's also like those connections, like continue to grow with like other students of other regions, because a lot of times, especially for us, we didn't want to have just, even though like in the media it seemed like it was mostly in Montreal. Annie, you mentioned this before, there was protests all around the province, and that's because we had hubs all around the province. And that importance of mentorship, I think, is something that like we noticed that was needed, and we are trying to like also like try to like push that forward of, we need to have access to mentorship for us to continue to grow and build on much more. uh, and I think whenever we're doing that work of mentorship, I feel like I'm creating an impact, knowing that I've helped build. I've saw 5 students that were coming in the movement, and I was able to assist and help and give them knowledge and give them resource, create those connections and make them connect through the movement as well. It's, for me, it's an impact, because I understand now that those 5 people that I initially brought in are now like leaders that are doing the same for other students, and we still continue to grow as a movement, and we're still continuing to see engagement even in the midst of pandemic. So for me, that's how like I feel like I created impact, is that sort of mentorship. um, Especially because when you're a student, you graduate at some point, or you have to like step out at some point, and make sure that that base will continue to live organically is very important for us.
I'm going to pick up on this, and then I'm going to loop back to Aurore, because to me, like, impact and measurement is very related to funder philosophy and expectations here. So just my quick take on the impact story around this is that the impact, it's kind of a backwards story. The impact happened once, like it was the Climate March of 2019 for any social movement in Canada. It blew away everyone's expectations. It was, you couldn't have planned such a huge thing, I think, years in advance. And so the question really becomes, how do we get back to that space or try to match it or exceed it again? And that becomes the project. How do we make sure it can keep happening to keep moving change along? But it's a non-linear thing, and it takes a funder who understands that and trusts the non-linearity of movement building. And without that trust from the Trottier Foundation, we couldn't have we wouldn't have been able to build things the way we did, experimentally in an emergent way. I do have, we can talk later about other indicators, but I think I'd like to pass it off to Aval just to speak to that side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing for like reporting and looking at impact is knowing how movements work, if it's different than other work that, say, a foundation is funding. And so that curve that you shared from Bill Moyer's, Tom, is actually really important to know. And knowing the mechanics of how movement building works is going to be really important, because it's very likely that the moment where there's 500,000 people in the street is not going to be in that granting cycle, and nor should we force it to be, just so that it fits within project cycles or reporting timelines. I think just on impact, a lot of the gap that the hub is coming to fill is providing support for the well-being of activists and organizers. And from the leadership development to burnout to program support, organizational development, all of the things that you've already mentioned, all of these are things that do make an impact on how we are able to take on the climate crisis and the changes that we need. So in terms of the wider mission of the Trottier Family Foundation of achieving sectoral and systemic change on these various issues, that's very aligned. So we're starting from that as a starting point. And then I think, just to come back a little bit to some of the early times. So there was a lot of trust between individuals in the foundation and Tom and other people in the climate movement in Quebec and across Canada. Like, this is applicable nationally, obviously. And there's a few things. The first one was there was a great feasibility study that Tom did. And I think that was really useful in order to scope what's possible and to learn from the funder's side too about what was needed, how it was actually a gap. So that was a way to be careful and not duplicating and reinventing the wheel just so that it would fit in a box. And also to go and test some assumptions and not think that we already know the solutions. And so the first one was, first thing that the foundation did was really listening. So being approached to fill a need. The board was invited to be at the table and build this new vehicle that draws on international practices. And so that required a lot of listening and a lot of willingness to address gaps. So not necessarily go where others are already funding. And then a second is right now, the Trottier Family Foundation is the sole funder that committed multi-year to the hub. And so that requires a risk-taking approach that I'm very proud to be part of a team that has that as an approach. And I think it was needed in this situation and will continue to be needed. And then a third element is providing stability. So it was a 2-year commitment. So I think the aspect of multi-year commitment is going to be really important too, especially in this kind of work and even more in a pandemic year, where that question of like measuring impact and how to know if something is working, you need some stability in order to let people do that work, and let it shine. And then I'd say the last thing that's notable is this flexibility and independence in programming, that Tom spoke to, and that required to let the partners that the foundation was working with Tom and all of the other advisors and people who joined the hub, to let them lead and let them make the decisions for what program made sense and what emerged, and just be in dialogue and be in the loop about how things are developing, and learn as we go, as I said, in order to know that it makes sense in a context of movement building to take this approach, or to build this kind of programming, like the conference that's coming up in May. All of the programming that we're starting to emerge now is possible because there were months of allowing for it to emerge and giving that flexibility. And we're, I think, really also glad that the hub is taking that listening to the broader movement seriously, in order to look at the intersection of the climate movement with racial justice and social justice. That happens to be something that we're also very excited about, and that it emerged organically from what the needs are on the ground. So yeah, just knowing that from the position of the institutional kind of privilege and influence and power that we have as foundations, we don't necessarily know what's going on the field, and to be able to let people who are in that front line tell us what is needed in the programming is something that I think, yeah, we're really proud of with the hub.
Thank you, Aha. And just to reiterate what Tom said earlier, there is research and there is a science to measuring the effectiveness and the impact of movement building, right? And there are some metrics that can be used. There are many impact measure metrics on narrative change. For example, it's a matter of using the right metrics for the right thing that you're building, and always being responsive and adapting and learning as you go, which is what you're all doing here. So congratulations. So I just want to remind everybody that you can drop your questions in the Q&A sections. On va maintenant accueillir les questions. Alors, s'il y a des choses qui vous passent par la tête, n'hésitez pas à écrire vos questions pour qu'on puisse y répondre. And I think maybe my last really wonky question, that's really for the funding community here. You're probably all wondering, like, how does that work with the constraints that we all have to operate under with the Canada Revenue Agency, and how are we able to provide those services that Tom and Ashley are providing, and those supports to what, unfortunately we label non-qualified donees. I hate that word, but all these people who don't fit in the CRA a charitable status box. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit, Tom, Ashley, and maybe Aha, like the mechanics of how you make that happen from a funding and a support perspective.
Yeah, sure. I'll kick this one off. I remember early on being schooled by different charitable administrators on just how careful, if you're supporting activism in this country, especially activism that threatens, the financial interests of the oil industry. So these people had learned the hard way how to be by the book, and really by the book. But from what I understood, capacity building and knowledge transfer to individuals, so straight up education and training is safe and good. And so that is really the approach that we took. And it helps that I think Ashley said relationships like a million times, but it's so true that this is a highly relational space that we're in. So getting those months of work that I've alluded to, were really getting to know who is key and who we should work with to transfer knowledge as individuals, because those individuals are key in their movements or groups that per se we could never fund or direct resource to, But we know that investing in these organizers and transferring knowledge to them, it will find its way to their movement because they are key people in that movement, and they will bring it back and they will share these frameworks and make them live within the organizations. But I think Ashley can speak to that just from the inside as well. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, I think that's such a like useful and like central thing to do. And it was like a really interesting approach when Tom like came to us and sort of like we started noticing that yeah, whenever you had like key people like myself, like a lot of different students uh be provided with this knowledge and be provided with these resources that are so vital uh, for us to continue to do the work and continue to do it in an effective manner, right? Because that's also something like we were doing the work, but we could have there was a tactics that we could have used or like uh, just things that we could have done that we will be more effective going forward. And so having access to all of this knowledge that like there's trainings, then with that knowledge we are able to, whenever we're preparing for like a conference within our students, we're able to influence that. We're able to say, hey, we've heard about these things, we could implement them. Maybe our structure is not very effective because these are the issues, we knew about them but we didn't know how to address them. And talking to experts or like talking to people who have seen this countless of times, this is a way that we could maybe improve our structure, our and to make it more effective and to like solve these issues that we were having for 2 years. And so it becomes really, for me, crucial to have uh, key people who will do that work of going back to their local groups and being like, hey, these are ways that we could actually improve or these are ideas that we like didn't even know that existed, because there's so much uh knowledge out there. And unfortunately, because of language barriers, that's also something that like a lot of information, it's for building movements, it's in English, and there's a lack of in that French world. So having those documents translated or like things like that are super important and have been for us firsthand very helpful, because we can then uh continue to improve and improve. And I think that's something uh that we have a tradition of doing in the student movement for striking, but we didn't have that for like the environment, because that's relatively new. A lot of people think, why is Quebec tuition so low? Well, that's because there's that sort of mentorship that goes on of like, we keep it low, we create cyclical movements. And that's something that we're trying to create now for the environmental movement, to make sure that like there's new people coming in. And I think Tom guiding us, because it's different, it looks different, we're not talking about tuition anymore, has been like very, very helpful for us on the ground, for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Aha, did you want to add a little bit to that on the non-qualified donee and what this means to be a funder of this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the kind of activities, first of all, that Tom and Ashley are describing and talking about. And I think, you know, funding coordination work, convening, capacity building, knowledge transfer, etc., that's not new to the funding community, and it is applicable here. I think the part where it's different is who we are talking about, and it required looking at who the actors are in the climate movement to see that there were groups that fell through cracks in terms of the funding and the ability to be funded. So, you know, our foundation has supported wonderful organizations that have charitable status and do work that is organizing work, mobilization, deep canvassing, etc. And there was this need with the hub that the hub can respond to reach groups that are more informal or that are nonprofits and be able to offer services. So the hub is a project of the Small Change Fund. And so we are, as a foundation, funding the Small Change Hub for that project of the hub. And so great thanks as well to the leadership of the Small Change Fund there, who is responding to that need and going to fill that gap to be able to support other actors and other change makers that aren't within the existing structures.
Yes, thank you, Aha. So I think I'm going to turn it to some of the questions that we received from our audience. I'll look at the questions that we've received. So first question, it comes from Florian Lemoine, who this morning met with a youth-led environmental organization that was struggling to mobilize online and with very low attendance at their webinars and events. And she was wondering if you found some successful ways to mobilize without physical contact on a large scale, or have you accepted the fact that this is the nature of capacity building in smaller scale connection? And she's referring specifically to how do you collaborate with influencers, podcasts, online petitions, or what are the other creative ways that you've found for online organizing?
I think I can go ahead and respond to that. There's different ways of doing it, and we found that having like, whenever you have like a specific campaign, and then try to see like what tactics you could do. You know, there's like a lot of things that in the US they do that we don't really do and doesn't require for us to meet, like calling, phone banking, email, like emailing, Twitter storms, things like that we usually don't do, and using social media in an effective way of like engaging with people. And I think in the rest of Canada, they're better at that than in Quebec. We have like that lack of like using social media to like sort of engage with people. And though the impact of that will be lower, you still have like that community sense of like, hey, here you are, this is something that like I am worrying about, what about you? And sort of creating these movements of like having whatever campaign you want to do of, hey, I'm doing this project, what can you do in your community? Or having that share of sense is something that, like, social media is something that we don't use. Creating content like podcasts, I've seen a lot of like young people doing. I think something that lacks, especially in French, there's no content of that, and having that sort of engagement, because whenever you speak about these issues and then other people relate, it will maybe activate them. So it's really important to have that communication line as well. But yeah, we've done things like postering, which are like going around community and doing like something related to art. So you have like you do this sort of art piece, you take a photo, you put it in the community, and then you take it down, you take it away with you, and then you again do it, you invite people in the community to do it as well. And poetry on eco-anxiety. And then yeah, it's hard to ask people right now to engage full on online, because especially students, if you're young, because we're online all day, and then after school, like we just don't want to be on Zoom anymore. But there's like interesting ways of doing that. Still, like using social media, I think it's very key for young folks to engage with, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we have in-house experts, as you all can see, and I just want to say, like, if there are questions like this on tactics for climate justice, social justice, and Indigenous organizing, it all fits within our climate justice umbrella. And we are in the process right now of opening up to the rest of Canada. So questions like that are what we're all about, and you can send people to info@lehub.ca to start a conversation with us. And that's what our day job is, to field questions like that, to try to offer advice, plug in experts like Ashley, and build. We're planning on getting a digital organizing expert on board for the rest of the year, who would kind of take on all questions like that for groups too. So send them our way.
And I'm going to point out, because I can do that because I'm a foundation, that these things also take money, right? Even if we're organizing digitally, if we're creating podcasts, if we're creating content, you need experts, you need time, and you need financial resources to serve that growing community of climate justice organizers across the country. We have another question for Ashley, someone who's wondering, as students and young adults, how can we restart the momentum around the Great Climate Action March on the level that we were at in September 2019 after the pandemic? So I think this is a bit of like, what can we hope, envision, imagine when we're allowed to take back the streets and the campuses and be in the physical presence of others? So are there some great scheme and great plans that you're dreaming of?
Yeah, I think that's like the question that we all have right now, and like eager to like get an answer. For me, what I envision, what I imagine is having the pandemic hit us really hard, and it sort of like strained us, but there are movements there that are young, youth led, like the Sunrise movement in the US, that continue to build that momentum, that are effectively doing change in the United States, where the landscape is so different, but we can draw things. So for me right now, I'm looking at them for inspiration and sort of looking at how they're organizing and how can we do something similar in Quebec. And is it going to be around our campuses? Probably, because it's a very easy way for us to engage with people in community. We have access to people. But for me, I'm looking a lot to them right now and seeing how I can sort of like take some of get inspired by some of their tactics, and sort of how do we apply it here in Quebec to build that momentum back again. Because I feel like, again, I think we were able to spark something, and it didn't just like died off. There's still people wanting to do this, and they're just waiting for us to be able to meet in person for it to start back. And so for me, it's like to be ready for that call when that call comes. So maybe start looking at trainings of like how do you like connect with in your community? How are we gonna be organizing? What are the issues that we want to speak about and expand this movement much more? For me, I think that's sort of like what I envision. But again, like to start it, look at what the Sunrise movement and how can we apply that here in Quebec, because we could.
And just to remind everyone that one of the young Black leaders of the Sunrise movement, who was picketing by himself in the US in front of the White House, is now part of one of the closest of advisors to Joe Biden in the White House on climate change. So you never know where this work is going to take you. That's an amazing personal story. I just want to make sure that everybody's watching the chat, because we've got some great resources that we posted during our presentation, including the annual conference en français du Hub qui se tiendra au mois de mai. Vous avez aussi une fiche d'information. So there is a fact sheet where you can see visually all the services and the support and what it is that the Climate Justice Organizing Hub does. I'm wondering if we have any concluding remarks from Tom, Ahar, or Ashley as we wrap up.
I can go ahead. Just also on those resources, there's one that we put in the chat that is less directly related to the hub, but I think relevant for the funder community, is the Environmental Funders Canada report on climate philanthropy that came out in September 2020. And so if you're not funding yet in climate, it's a good place to start. And some of their recommendations are to go and fill gaps where they are, to fund convening work. And so it is extremely relevant. I would say, to conclude, that if if you're not funding climate mitigation, start doing it. And if you're doing environmental work, start doing social and racial justice work. You know, we haven't talked a lot about it, but climate change is a threat multiplier. So whatever you are working on, it will be impacted by it, or it is impacted by it. And the root causes are similar. And the wonderful thing about movement building as an approach is that it's very likely to have a broader narrative impact and to be able to talk about what connects the dots between health and poverty alleviation and community work and food security. And so it's not just about the greenhouse gases emissions, that we can have an impact on the climate crisis. So that's one. And another is that I would invite other foundations, and several are doing that already, and maybe we can connect to talk more about that, about supporting mobilization approaches and about supporting organizing work, because, you know, as we talked about for the last hour, it needs resources, and it needs resources in between moments, and we have a chance with the hub to have a vehicle for that, and there are others for other movements as well. So that I would definitely encourage other funders to do. And one thing that we haven't talked a lot about today, but at our foundation, we've divested our funds from fossil fuels and are doing impact investing, and are kind of doing that side as well of trying to shift the discourse and be engaged and speak with move the money in different ways. And so that's also something that can be done. And we can talk about all of that. And I definitely encourage everyone to go to the Hubs conference in May. The programming looks fantastic. So I'm very excited about it.
Thank you. And just a reminder of the mechanics of how this works. The Small Change Fund, which I've put in the chat, is the charitable fiduciary through which the charitable donations can be made to the Climate Justice Organizing Hub. So any donations and support are always welcome. And I'm going to take my prerogative as a moderator to end my contribution to this discussion, and before I pass it back on to Ines with a quote, because we've talked so much about the importance of relationship building in movement building and organizing, and Ashley has talked about it so eloquently. For those of you who want to learn more about movement building and organizing, there's this great book, Emergent Strategy, that I would recommend by Adrienne Mary Brown. But I would like to read a beautiful quote from this book to thank you all for the amazing work that you're doing, and to hopefully give us a bit of hope, because it is daunting, especially in the context of a pandemic, to continue to do this work. So Adrienne Mary Brown speaks in her book, and what motivates us to keep building these relationships and sustain these networks really is love. And she says that if love were the central practice of a new generation of organizers, it would have a massive impact on what was considered organizing. If the goal was to increase the love rather than winning or dominating a constant opponent, I think we could actually imagine liberation from constant oppression. We would suddenly be seeing everything we do, everyone we meet, not through the tactical eyes of war, but through the eyes of love. We would see that there's no such thing as a blank canvas, an empty land, or a new idea, but everywhere there is complex, ancient, fertile ground of potential. We would organize with the perspective that there is wisdom and experience, an amazing story in the communities we love. And instead of starting up new ideas and organization all the time, we would want to listen, support, collaborate, merge, and grow through fusion, not competition. We would understand that the strength of our movement is in the strength of our relationship, which can only be measured by their depths. And I think that's a very good illustration of the depth and the support and all the wonderful work that the Climate Justice Organizing Hub has done. So thank you so much for inviting me in that conversation, and I'll turn it back to Inès.
Merci Annie. Comment faire suite à ça? C'est compliqué. En fait, je vais te permettre d'enlever ton chapeau de modératrice et te poser une question. Il y a cette volonté au sein de notre secteur ou notre communauté philanthropique de collaborer davantage et de s'engager davantage dans le changement systémique. Je sais que tu es impliqué dans plusieurs initiatives de ce type-là et je voudrais te donner l'opportunité de toucher à cette question-là, de dire quelques mots là-dessus et ce que tu penses qu'on devrait faire en tant que communauté philanthropique, surtout concernant cette question de justice climatique.
Mm-hmm. Ben, merci Inès. En fait, on a l'opportunité de collaborer. I'm going to switch back to English. Sorry. PFC has gracefully hosted the Climate Collab, where we've started collaborating with philanthropic foundations in Quebec to start with. I'm doing a lot of that work with the rest of Canada as well. But essentially what we're hearing more and more from philanthropic foundations who are investing in public health or healthcare or education or youth leadership is that all these investment and these philanthropic grants are threatened by climate change. Nobody will be spared by climate change. And that the impacts of climate change that we are seeing today will only exacerbate the income inequalities in our society that we're all fighting for, no matter which sector of the philanthropy that we're working in. So there's definitely a desire by philanthropic foundations that are in more traditional sectors that are not involved in the environment to understand how they can mobilize their community to take action on climate. And often they don't know where to start. So movement building, organizing is a great place to start because we need a multitude of voices at the table, not just the youth and not just the environmental group, but the public health officials, the business sectors. They can all benefit from these tools. And without this broad, constant social mandate, we won't be able to sustain the kind of commitments that we need in line with climate science from all levels of government. So I would invite anyone who's interested in joining this conversation to contact Inès at PFC, because we are reaching out beyond the environmental funding sector to leverage commitments from other philanthropic foundations. So I'm happy to have those conversations.
Thank you, Annie. And it has been reinforced by the conversation today. We know that climate change has, far-reaching impacts that on society that are beyond environment, and as Annie said, and so given the implications of for our work in the philanthropic sector, as well as our nonprofit partners, I just wanted to share with you, and building on what Annie has said, that in addition to the Climate Collab, there is another opportunity to learn more and or to contribute. And PFC is working alongside different philanthropic networks and has been invited to participate in a global task force that is coordinated by WINGS. WINGS is the international network of philanthropic associations throughout the world, with a view to drafting an international philanthropic climate commitment that will lead us to this year's climate change conference in November of 2021, the Conference of the Parties. So if you're interested to know more, I know Annie is involved in it. Some of my colleagues at PFC are also involved in it. So please reach out to any of us, and then we will ensure that it does land in the right hands. So thank you all to the panelists. First of all, this was very inspiring and hopeful. It really gave me a lot of positive energy, and I hope it did the same to our audience today. I just wanted to remind you that there is going to be a short survey that's going to pop up on your screen when you leave the webinar. Please take a couple of minutes to answer. It's really helpful for us to ensure quality of our webinars, but also on suggestions for topics. We always look at our members for those. So I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and we will see you next time in 2 weeks' time. Our webinar is going to talk about impact investing and how to ensure you have an equity lens in your investing. So thank you so much, everyone.